Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we'll talk about a position in the free will debate that is less popular than other views we've covered so far. On this view, which we'll call Mysterianism, we have free will, but it is a mystery how it is that we have free will.
Our guest is Seth Shabo, and our next episode is going to be a Q&A episode, so if you have questions that you'd like us to answer, get in touch with us through our website, thefreewillshow.com, or via social media, @thefreewillshow. I'm happy to introduce Seth Shabo, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Delaware. Seth has written several articles on a variety of topics in the free will debate, including a series of papers on the problem of luck for Libertarian views. While he does not identify as a Mysterian about free will, which is the subject of today's episode, he's defended aspects of the view in print and has graciously agreed to be our spokesperson for the episode. So welcome to the show, Seth. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on free will?
Sure, yeah. And thank you for the invitation to be on the show. I guess the short answer as to how it all started was really with the Frankfurt cases. And I won't recap the cases since I know you did an episode on that. Mm-hmm. But when I was starting out in philosophy grad school, I never really imagined that I'd end up writing my dissertation on free will and moral responsibility. When free will came up in my coursework, it was always sort of on the periphery of some other topic. And so it wasn't really until I started teaching the material as a graduate instructor that I had a chance to really sort of delve into that debate. And so happens that Peter Van Inwagen left my department for Notre Dame, left Syracuse for Notre Dame, I think just a year or two before I started. So that was a bummer.
Yeah.
But it was probably because of his lingering influence on the program that there was a unit in the survey course that all of us graduate students taught at the time, a unit on free will. And one of the topics that we covered was the Frankfurt cases, and that was really my route into the debate and just thinking through just how they work and how they challenge that seemingly unchallengeable link between moral responsibility and free will, and how that challenge kind of reshaped the whole landscape of the debate. All of that really sort of prompted me to look further into that literature, and pretty soon I found myself immersed in the work of Van Inwagen and John Fisher. And at that point, I guess you could say there was no turning back. And that happened to be right around the time when I was selecting my dissertation topic. So I guess you could say that teaching the Frankfurt cases was the point of departure for me from the path that I had been on. And from there, I was able to connect up some of the topics I was interested in free will with things I'd been interested in before, like, topics in moral psychology. So I'm still very interested in the reactive attitudes. That's something I write on. Mm-hmm. But yep, the Frankfurt cases were really the initial hook.
Yeah, cool. Well, in season 1, we interviewed Peter Van Inwagen about free will and determinism, focusing on the consequence argument for incompatibilism. But he also laid out what he calls the problem of free will. Could you explain what you take the problem of free will to be?
Yeah, so I'm going to follow Van Inwagen's understanding. I'll set out what I take him to mean by it. And so just a quick note on terminology. Just by free will, I'm going to mean the ability to do otherwise. So, when we say that that an action was an exercise of free will, we're implying that the person was able to have taken a different course of action instead. And with moral responsibility, I'm also going to follow Van Inwagen, at least in my focus. So I'm going to take the statement that moral responsibility exists to imply whatever else, that it's sometimes true that people are morally to blame for the consequences of their actions. And then, despite my sympathy for the Frankfurt cases, which challenge the association of moral responsibility with free will. I'm just going to take that association on board here in my exposition of the problem of free will. So I'm going to assume, just for the sake of discussion, that that moral responsibility does depend on free will. Probably nothing will actually really turn on that, but it'll just be easier to think of free will as short for the term free will. The expression free will is short for free will and moral responsibility, and a lot of what I say about the problem of free will.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the problem? Well, we can think of it, Van Inwagen's problem, as a paradox involving three statements, and each of those statements appears to be true on its own, but taken together, they form an inconsistent set. So what are the three statements? First, we are morally responsible agents. That is to say, we're sometimes morally to blame for the consequences of our actions, which requires free will. Second statement is that the incompatibilists are right, that more fully, there are decisive arguments that we lack free will and moral responsibility if determinism is true. And then the third statement is that the libertarians are wrong, or more fully, other compelling arguments show that we lack free will in performing causally undetermined actions, so that we're not morally blameworthy for the consequences of those actions. So these three statements can't all be true. Something has to give. So it looks like either we'll have to give up our belief in free will, or else accept that one of the two sets of arguments, either the anti-compatibilist argument or the anti-libertarian argument, isn't sound after all, contrary to appearances. So that's the problem.
Great. That's very clear, helpful. So now, what is the position that we're calling Mysterianism? How does the Mysterian respond to this problem of free will?
Good. So Mysterianism, and I'm going to take that to be a name for Peter Van Inwagen's particular view. So Mysterianism is a response to this problem, but I don't think you could really call it a solution. It's a response that concedes that there is no satisfying or illuminating answer to the problem. But the Mysterian takes a position on these issues all the same. So the view requires a little bit of unpacking. For starters, the Mysterian says that free will is a real but mysterious feature of human agency. How is it mysterious? Well, in two respects. First, just to sort of repeat what I already said, I guess free will is mysterious in that there's no adequate answer to these arguments that, taken together, seem to rule out free will. And further, there's no adequate account of how a causally undetermined action could be an exercise of free will and not a mere matter of chance. But the Mysterian continues, the two sets of arguments, the anti-compatibilist argument and the anti-libertarian argument, while both seemingly unanswerable, aren't quite on the same footing. If we have free will, as the Mysterian believes we do, one set of arguments must be rejected, and Van Inwagen rejects the anti-libertarian arguments, even though he can't see where they go wrong. But, and just to add yet another wrinkle, and this is where things get even more interesting, he says that if he were to come to accept determinism, if he were forced to accept the truth of determinism, he'd abandon his commitment to incompatibilism rather than his belief in free will. So what we have here, just kind of summing up, is a set of tiered commitments, with the deepest commitment being to the reality of free will and moral responsibility, the second deepest to the soundness of the anti-compatibilist arguments or the arguments for incompatibilism, and the third to the soundness of the anti-libertarian arguments. And so it's the third that will sort of go first when push comes to shove, even if there's no way to see, to pinpoint what the hidden flaw in these arguments must be. So that's the Mysterian view as I understand it.
Yeah, very clear. Could you say a bit about what Mysterianism has in common with other views in the free will debate? and also what's distinctive about it?
Yeah, sure. So Mysterianism is a libertarian view. And so, like other libertarians, the Mysterian believes that we do have free will while seeing the compatibilists' conditions for free will as falling short. So the Mysterian rejects determinism. At the same time, though, the Mysterian is at odds with other libertarians, both those who think there never was much of a mystery to begin with, and those who think that there is a kind of mystery, an initial mystery at least, but that the mystery can be solved with the right libertarian account. So the Mysterian is at odds with both of those fellow travelers in the libertarian camp. So according to the Mysterian, the mystery is both real and insoluble, but it nonetheless makes sense to endorse both incompatibilism and the thesis that we have free will.
So you've characterized this as Peter Van Inwagen's view with these tiered commitments,
Mhm.
but it's open to be Mysterianism or a Mysterianist in different ways, though, right?
Sure.
I mean, you could alter the ordering of these tiered commitments, or I guess there's various different ways where this could work out, and you could still be a Mysterianist.
That's right. No, I would certainly accept that. And one of the things I thought about incorporating was a little bit about how there are certainly other possible Mysterian views. This isn't the only one with regard to free will that we could imagine, but this is the one that we seem to be talking about when we talk about Mysterianism. And it's the one, that seems to have the most. It's the one that's served as the kind of the stalking horse for other positions in the debate, and so that's why I thought I'd focus in on Van Inwagen's account.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure more about the view will come up in talking about responding to objections, but let's go ahead and turn to an objection kind of coming from the skeptical position. So I could imagine a skeptic saying, well, if free will is such a mystery, if we can't figure out how to solve, say, the problem of luck or how an undetermined action could be a free action, then maybe the reasonable move to make here is just to give up our view of ourselves as free and morally responsible. So what do you think the Mysterian can say in response to this kind of objection from the skeptic?
Good. So so before I answer the question about the skeptic in particular, I'm just going to take a short step back and say that, it looks to me like Mysterianism is likely to face pressure on pretty much on all three fronts, from free will skeptics or hard incompatibilists, from compatibilists, including semi-compatibilists like Fisher, and from libertarians, some of whom might say that there's, one possible view is that there's just less to free will than writers like Van Inwagen have thought. But so, let's start with the skeptic then. The skeptic will say that if you concede that you can't answer the challenges to free will, the challenges that you yourself have set out, if you concede that you have no good answer to them and that you find them compelling, you should at least be open to the possibility that free will is an illusion, especially seeing as you've offered no comparably strong argument in defense of free will. So the skeptic will say, look, shouldn't you at least consider yourself a kind of free will agnostic? And so the question we're left with then is whether it's legitimate for Van Inwagen to treat the reality of free will as a kind of a fixed position in a way that isn't up for debate.
That was a response that has to do with the skeptic. What about the compatibilist? Van Inwagen says that he thinks we have free will and that free will is incompatible with determinism, so he's a libertarian despite being a Mysterian. However, he says that if we were to be convinced that determinism was true, then he would become a compatibilist. John Fisher calls this flip-flopping, and he's argued that Van Inwagen should simply endorse compatibilism now. What do you think of this idea of flip-flopping?
So compatibilists are going to make a related point to the one that the skeptics made, but from a different angle. And so we can put their concern like this. If free will and moral responsibility are a kind of fixed point, something that you're not prepared to put up for debate, they'll say to Van Inwagen, and that you'd be prepared to abandon your incompatibilism if you came to accept determinism as true, shouldn't you count yourself as a compatibilist, maybe a reluctant or ambivalent compatibilist, but a compatibilist all the same. So yeah, as John Fisher puts it, saying that you're an incompatibilist while also saying that you'd reject incompatibilism if you came to accept determinism seems to involve a kind of flip-flopping, seems to invite the charge that you're flip-flopping, and that seems to be a dialectically suspect position, one that should be avoided. And so one way I've heard Fisher put this, put the point is like this, and I'm condensing what he says a little bit, but I think it's faithful to the spirit of what he says. So so Fisher says in the counterfactual scenario where Van Inwagen comes to accept determinism, Van Inwagen will end up rejecting the seemingly compelling arguments for incompatibilism because he's going to have to concede that there's some good reason to reject them. But if there's a good reason to reject them in the counterfactual scenario where you accept determinism, those reasons will apply in the actual scenario too, where you don't happen to accept determinism. And I would add, just as a follow-up to Fisher's way of making the point, there's one other way of making it that I think is worthwhile, which is this. And if you're Van Inwagen, you think we have free will and that our having it depends on the falsity of determinism, yet for all you know, determinism is true, even if you're committed to its not being true. And if it is true, your incompatibilism implies that we don't have free will, yet you're not prepared to accept that we don't have it, that we don't in fact have free will. So why insist that free will is incompatible with determinism when your commitment to free will is, it looks like, independent of your rejection of determinism? So that's how I would, and maybe that's another way of making the flip-flopping point, but that's, I think, that's how I would be inclined to put the point as a kind of a follow-up to Fisher's way of putting it.
So that's two sets of objections, really, one sort of from the skeptic and one from the compatibilist. What do you think that these critics have a point, or do you think there's something that can be said on behalf of Mysterianism here?
Yeah, so I do think they have a point, but I also think that Van Inwagen has a point. And so what I have in mind is this. It seems to me that there are, in a way, two perspectives to see the issue from. If we take a dialectical perspective and think about what I've elsewhere called the vindication conditions for the different sides in the debate, then it does seem very reasonable to say with Fisher that Van Inwagen, with Fisher and the skeptic, that Van Inwagen needs to put something on the table, to put something up for debate. So in other words, he should be prepared to give up his belief in free will if he sees no way to answer the objections to it, or to give up his incompatibilism if he would give it up if he were forced to accept determinism. So from this standpoint, there does seem to be something suspect or fishy about his approach to maintaining these different commitments. So that's the first perspective, and I genuinely feel the pull of that perspective. But I also see another perspective, and which I guess I'd put like this, just we're engaging in these philosophical debates to figure out what's true. And we use the vindication conditions within the debates as a guide to the truth conditions for the relevant positions or the relevant statements that express those positions. But we can imagine finding ourselves, or one can imagine finding oneself in a position like this, in a situation like this. Your convictions about what's true or real, your fundamental convictions about reality on a certain matter are stronger than your convictions about the success of the arguments in the debate, as strong as the latter convictions may be. So what if you find that it really just doesn't seem credible, just doesn't wash at the end of the day, that people aren't morally to blame for the consequences of their actions, at least at least assuming that we're not radically mistaken about a whole host of other things. So at that point, the concern about flip-flopping maybe kicks back in. So why not then, you might say, why not be a reluctant compatibilist, or at least an agnostic about the compatibility question? And I think Fisher's right to believe that the pressure on Mysterianism is real and substantial. But I also think Van Inwagen can say that, as things stand, he finds the arguments for incompatibilism to be thoroughly, deeply convincing. And in the hypothetical scenario where he's forced to abandon it, he would be conceding that there's a reason why it fails, but that reason would remain inscrutable. You would have to say that there's a hidden reason that, despite the seemingly ineluctable logic that supports incompatibilism, there's a hidden reason why that argument fails. And so given the strength of the conviction that incompatibilism is true and that the arguments for it succeed, which is second only to the strength of the conviction that we have free will, I think it does make sense for Van Inwagen to hang tough and resist the pressure I've described and remain a libertarian rather than a compatibilist, even if that stance doesn't seem dialectically satisfying. But I would add that seems tenable only on the assumption that the crux of his argument against compatibilism is as compelling as he takes it to be.
Yeah, there seems to be kind of like a more like a G.E. Moore type move here in response to this worry. So like your convictions about the nature of reality are way more strong, right? Way stronger than some clever philosophical argument. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to put it. It's just, that's right. Your conviction about what's real carries more weight, and you can't really be expected not to have it carry more weight than something that's than these thoughts that are a bit more sort of abstract by nature.
We've talked about objections from the skeptic and from the compatibilist, but we could also consider an objection from the libertarian. So how might the libertarian come at this?
Yeah, so there are different angles that another libertarian, a non-Mysterian libertarian, might take, depending on whether they endorse an agent causal or an event causal or a non-causal view. But I think probably the really interesting division in this case among libertarians is going to be between libertarians like Kane, who think that there is a real problem for libertarians about how to make free will or moral responsibility for a causally undetermined action intelligible, but think that it can be pulled off, and maybe not, to the greatest possible degree of satisfaction, but well enough to make it plausible that we are morally responsible for these actions in a way that we wouldn't be if they were just kind of random outcomes or causally determined by events in the distant past. So that's one side of the division. And the other side thinks, oh, look, compatibilists are basically right about the conditions for moral responsibility. All we really need to add is the right sort of event causal indeterministic account of action, and there really isn't anything particularly mysterious about free will. And despite the very substantial differences in their particular accounts, I think both Chris Franklin and Laura Ekstrom might sort of fall into this camp of thinking that it was a mistake to sort of inflate free will into something that gives rise to the appearance of a mystery, when really we have arguments that show that you're not free and morally responsible if determinism is true, but otherwise the compatibilist conditions are right, and all we really need to do is to add indeterminism in the right place, and there's room for disagreement about what the right place is, but all we need to do is figure out where to sort of insert indeterminism into the best compatibilist account, and we're good to go. And there's no mystery, and there never really should have been. The luck objections don't really get that much traction, and so forth. So that's so I think in response, I'm sympathetic to the Kane side of this divide and thinking that there really is a problem that libertarians face. Maybe the formulations that we've had so far, the influential ones, aren't fully, they're not fully compelling as they stand, but they really are onto something all the same. And the way I would try to recast them a little bit, and this is, you can find this thread out there, but the way I'm inclined to put it is to say, to put the issue is to say that libertarians need to be able to explain how a choice, a causally undetermined choice or other action could be up to you in the right way, a way that makes you morally responsible for it, when you're not morally responsible for for how a random number generator's outcome turns out when you activate it. I mean, sure, you could be indirectly responsible for activating it, but you're not directly morally responsible for whether it generates an odd number or an even number once you've activated it. And so I'm inclined to say that just saying that the outcome is your action isn't enough. That can't be enough to make it the case that it's up to you which action occurred. And so I think that's what the libertarian needs to explain. And I think one way to further put pressure on the libertarian here is to say that that an important question is whether you can reasonably be expected in your what we might call your torn state following, I think Balaguer introduced that particular phrase. In your torn state, he would say, I'm sort of adopting his phrase now, can we reasonably expect you to take the course of action that you believe to be the morally right course of action, given that your belief about what's right and everything else about you has already been factored into the probability distribution at that moment. And so I think it's going to be hard for the libertarian to make the case that that normative expectation is reasonable. And so I think there really is a problem for the libertarians, and that libertarians who try to have a sort of a lighter footprint, like Chris Franklin, I think their views end up being too deflationary. So they seem to avoid the mystery, but at the cost of giving up a kind of a robust notion of free will.
Interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do you think there are any other worries for libertarianism that the Mysterian can appeal to, or do you think really the main worry or the only worry is the problem of luck?
I mean, to me, it's always seemed like the really pressing problem is the problem of luck. But I would add that the problem of luck, I mean, what we're calling the problem of luck, if we think about what that phrase picks out, might be a little bit more varied than the expression sometimes suggests. So I'm not sure it has to be really bound up with the concept of luck per se.
Yeah, interesting. Well, moving on to a kind of different sort of objection. Philosophers are not known for their appeals to mystery, and perhaps some will not regard it as a sort of philosophically respectable position in the free will debate. So is there some reason to think that the appeal to mystery is fitting here in this case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's certainly not an enviable position for someone to find themselves in, for a theorist to find themselves in. So I think of it as the nettle that libertarians must grasp. I'm speaking now on behalf of Van Inwagen, but is it a respectable option of last resort? And I think we're going to have to evaluate Mysterian views on a topic by topic basis. So I suppose I think it's never something that you really want to embrace, but is there reason enough to sort of grasp the nettle in a particular area? Well, I think that's going to depend on the contours of the particular topic that you're in. So what we're asking really is Van Inwagen's stance a kind of intellectually respectable response to the pressures that lead him to adopt it, and notwithstanding the pressures that the view remains subject to? And so far, at least, I'm inclined to think the answer is yes, even though critics like Fisher are right to find the view dialectically problematic. At least it seems to me that it's intellectually respectable if you allow that someone could legitimately remain more convinced of the reality of free will and moral responsibility than they are of the soundness of the arguments that seem to rule out free will and moral responsibility. And if you allow, in addition, that they could still find the arguments for incompatibilism to be completely convincing, to find them convincing to the point where they can't simply give them up. So altogether, I'm inclined to think that the pressures this view faces are real. Fisher and others are not wrong to question whether this view really is tenable. But on balance, I'm inclined to think it's problematic, but not untenable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks, Seth. So I mentioned earlier that you're our spokesperson for Mysterianism, but not a Mysterian yourself. Would you want to say a little bit about your own position in the free will debate?
Sure. Yeah. So the view I'm inclined to is that basic desert, as it's sometimes called, is incompatible with determinism, but that members of a moral community can nevertheless have a non-consequentialist basis for holding one another morally responsible for engaging in blame. And that's because when somebody demands to be exempted, they will sometimes end up by doing so, showing that they're insufficiently committed to the standards of the moral community that give their demand its sort of authority. Mm-hmm. And so even if determinism is true, some demands to be exempted, say on the basis of determinism, won't meet the conditions for being acceptable. And that's why it won't be unfair to blame the person for their actions under those conditions and to reject their demand for exemption.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So something in common with the revisionist position we just talked about with Manuel Vargas, and something in common with Greg Caruso's free will skepticism. It's nice that this kind of brings together a bunch of the other episodes in this season.
Yeah, that is interesting. You were talking about being morally responsible for the consequences of your actions, but not everybody takes moral responsibility to just be about the consequences of our actions. So especially in debates about PAP, the
Absolutely.
primary locus of responsibility is not consequences, it's like choices or decisions. So do you think that this distinction between being morally responsible for consequences and being morally responsible for just choices, is that relevant to this debate about Mysterianism?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I tried in characterizing moral responsibility earlier. I tried to leave open what the scope of moral responsibility is. The standard libertarian view, or at least maybe it's not the standard, but one of the leading libertarian views is that what we're morally responsible for in the first place are choices, and only derivatively for consequences. So you might say it's a kind of an idiosyncratic feature of Van Inwagen's view that he thinks that when it comes to blame attributions or attributions of blameworthiness, what we're fundamentally concerned with are consequences, or states of affairs.
Yeah.
I tried to leave that open by saying that whatever else, I'm going to take statements about the statement that moral responsibility exists as implying that we're sometimes to blame for the consequences of our actions. Does it change things much if we? I suspect that Van Inwagen's arguments against libertarianism would still have the same force. I mean, the arguments that he thinks ultimately must fail, but for a hidden reason. I think he would find them to have as much force if we take the locus to be about actions, which is what his arguments are about. And so he usually focuses on actions like telling the truth or lying. But I think you could run the same arguments in terms of mental acts like choosing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Seth. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Right now, probably the philpeople.org website is the best place. Otherwise, feel free to email me at my UDEL email address if you have trouble downloading a paper.
All right.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thanks again for being with us. Our next episode is going to be a Q&A episode. So if you've got any questions that you want us to answer, feel free to reach out to us via social media or thefreewillshow.com.